Smoke rose from the chimney of a forest cabin. A father and son decided to check who lived in the wilderness and went inside. But what they found behind the door was the beginning of a nightmare that no one should ever know about. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are watching from. The October sun lingered low in the sky, filtering its pale golden light through the thinning canopy of the forest as father and son began their long-anticipated journey. The season was in that fleeting moment when autumn had not yet surrendered fully to the cold grip of winter, but the air already carried a sharpness that warned of the weeks to come. Fallen leaves blanketed the forest floor in shades of copper and rust, crunching under boots with every step, while the distant mountains rose like ancient guardians, their granite ridges dusted with the first hints of snow. The wilderness had its own kind of silence, a silence that was not empty, but alive with hidden life, with whispers of wind in the pines and the faint calls of unseen birds. For Marcus, the father, the forest had always been a sanctuary, a place where the noise of the world dissolved and life could be stripped to its essentials. For his son, Ethan, this trip was not only an escape, but a test, though he did not yet know what the forest intended to reveal to them. Marcus had long believed in the value of these excursions. As a child, he himself had been led into the woods by his own father, who had taught him how to find true north without a compass, how to trace the path of a river, how to read the language of moss on rocks and bark. It was in the silence of the mountains that he had learned patience, and in the struggles of setting up camp or enduring storms that he had learned resilience. Now, standing in his middle years, with lines of time deepening around his eyes, he wanted to pass this inheritance on to Ethan. The boy was at that precarious age, balanced between boyhood and the threshold of manhood, restless, defiant, uncertain of himself. School had become a battleground where he fought not only numbers and words, but the gnawing sense that he was never good enough. Arguments at home had left him resentful, his laughter less frequent, his gaze often distant. Marcus feared losing him to the invisible walls of adolescence, to the world of screens and silence. The forest, he thought, might heal what words at home could not. Their backpacks were heavy with the essentials of survival: sleeping bags, a compact stove, dried food, and water canisters. Ethan carried his own gear, smaller and lighter, but still sufficient to test his endurance. He trudged beside his father with quiet determination, though every so often his eyes drifted to the treetops, where the sunlight played and shadows danced. For him, the forest was both intimidating and mesmerizing. There was beauty in the endless stretch of trunks, in the flashes of deer bounding away into thickets, in the soft chatter of squirrels leaping from branch to branch. Yet there was also unease. The deeper they went, the more the forest seemed to swallow the world they had left behind. The sound of cars, the hum of electricity, the chatter of neighbors, all had faded, leaving only the breathing of the earth itself. That first evening, they set up camp near a clearing, where a brook ran shallow and clear over stones, polished smooth by centuries of flow. Marcus showed Ethan how to pitch the tent so it would withstand sudden winds, how to build a fire from damp wood by shaving thin curls until sparks caught flame. The boy watched with narrowed eyes, imitating every movement, his hands clumsy at first, but steadier with each attempt. When the fire finally flared and began to crackle, a flicker of pride lit Ethan's face. They shared a simple meal, warmed beans and bread, the taste enhanced not by seasoning, but by hunger earned from hours of walking. The fire painted their faces in orange glow, while the forest grew darker around them, until only the shifting shadows of trees remained. The night pressed in like a living thing. Far above, The stars emerged one by one, filling the sky with a brilliance Ethan had rarely seen through the haze of city lights. He lay on his back outside the tent for a long while, his breath fogging in the cool air, his eyes wide at the immensity of it all. Marcus sat beside him, content in the silence. Father and son did not need many words that night. The fire, the stars, and the rhythm of the brook spoke for them. Still, Marcus could sense the undercurrent of fear in his son. Every snap of a twig beyond the circle of firelight made Ethan turn his head. Every call of a nightbird made him shift uneasily. Marcus placed a hand on the boy's shoulder, steady and reassuring, reminding him without words that he was not alone. When they finally retreated into the tent, the wind whispered through the branches like an ancient song, and Ethan fell asleep listening to his father's steady breathing beside him. The second day began with a chill, mist draping itself across the ground and clinging to their clothes as they packed their belongings. The forest smelled of wet leaves and pine resin, earthy and raw. They followed a narrow trail deeper into the woods, where the canopy thickened and light fell in broken fragments. Marcus walked with the sure stride of a man who had spent much of his life in the wild, while Ethan followed with determination, though fatigue weighed on his steps. Their path wound around boulders and across fallen logs, demanding balance and patience. Marcus took every opportunity to teach, how to notice the shift of shadows that told the time, how to listen for the direction of running water, how to look for signs of weather changes in the way the clouds gathered. Ethan absorbed the knowledge silently, storing it as though it were treasure. By afternoon, the mist lifted, revealing the forest in its full splendor. Shafts of light broke through the canopy, illuminating floating motes of dust and pollen like drifting stars. Birds flitted from branch to branch, their calls echoing high above. Ethan began to relax, his steps more confident, his gaze less guarded. The forest was beginning to weave its spell on him. He felt the quiet strength of its trees, the patience of stones that had lain unmoved for centuries, the rhythm of the brook that would flow long after he was gone. For the first time in weeks, his shoulders lowered, his jaw unclenched. He allowed himself to be simply a boy in the company of his father, without the weight of expectation pressing down. It was then, as they paused to drink from their canteens on a small ridge, that Ethan noticed something strange. He pointed through the trees, his brow furrowed. Marcus followed his gaze. There, rising faintly against the backdrop of sky and branches, was a thin column of smoke. At first it seemed almost like mist, a wisp caught in the air. But as they watched, it curled upward in a steady thread. Smoke meant fire, and fire meant people. Yet according to Marcus's map, there were no ranger stations, no cabins, no known campsites anywhere in this section of forest. Ethan's eyes widened with curiosity and unease. His father studied the smoke in silence, weighing possibilities. It could be hunters, perhaps, or a lone hiker with a campfire. It could also mean trouble, a fire left unattended, or someone in need. The wilderness was too unforgiving to ignore signs of human presence. Marcus adjusted his pack, decision hardening in his mind. He told Ethan they would alter their course slightly to investigate. In the forest, he explained, one does not turn away from the unknown. Curiosity and caution walk hand in hand. Ethan hesitated, unease gnawing at him, but he followed, trusting his father's judgment. The smoke became their beacon as they descended from the ridge and plunged deeper into the trees. The air grew heavier, the silence more pronounced. Birds that had filled the canopy with song earlier seemed to have vanished. Even the wind seemed reluctant to stir. Marcus noted the absence, but said nothing. He kept his pace steady, his senses alert. Ethan walked behind him, glancing back more often than forward, as though fearing what might follow rather than what lay ahead. The forest seemed to shift around them, its mood darker, its presence heavier. Yet the smoke continued to rise, a slender finger pointing upward, guiding them to whatever waited beyond the next hill. When evening began to fall again, the last rays of sunlight cutting slanted beams through the trunks, they found themselves close enough to smell the faint tang of wood smoke in the air. The scent was not of pine, but of something older, a denser kind of wood that burned slower, thicker. Marcus's unease grew, though he masked it well. He led Ethan toward the source, each step carrying them deeper into mystery. Father and son, bound together by blood and silence, walked toward the thin line of smoke that curled above the trees, not knowing that with every step they were leaving behind the safe, familiar world and entering another, where the rules of nature bent toward secrecy and menace. The forest closed around them as they moved deeper in the direction of the smoke, the light behind them fading into shadows that grew longer with every step. What had begun as a faint thread rising above the treetops was now nearer, tangible in the air, for the smell of burning wood drifted unmistakably through the branches. The silence pressed against their ears, the cheerful chatter of birds and the rustle of small creatures that had filled the morning seemed to vanish, as if the entire forest were holding its breath. Marcus felt the shift, a subtle warning that not everything was as it seemed. But he walked with steady pace, his hand occasionally brushing aside branches, his boots pressing firmly into the damp ground. Ethan followed, his own footsteps less certain, glancing constantly from side to side, as if he half expected someone to emerge suddenly from the shadows. They descended into a shallow valley, where the trees grew denser and their trunks rose like pillars of an ancient cathedral. The canopy above blocked much of the evening light, leaving the ground in twilight even though the sun had not yet fully set. The smell of smoke grew stronger here, mixed with damp earth and decaying leaves. They passed moss-covered rocks, roots twisted like serpents, and fallen trunks that looked like bones of giant beasts long since rotted away. Ethan's unease deepened with every step, and though he wanted to speak, to beg his father to turn back, he kept his silence. He could see the determination in Marcus's stride, the quiet authority of a man who believed he had to understand what lay ahead, no matter the cost. At last they crested a small ridge and looked down into a hollow that seemed oddly shaped, almost as if the earth itself had sunk long ago and then been reclaimed by time. Trees leaned inward, as though guarding a secret, their roots snaking across the mound of soil and moss. Rising from the very center of the hollow was the object they had followed, a rusted metal pipe jutting upward from the ground, bent slightly at the top, and from it curled the steady ribbon of smoke they had seen from afar. There was no sign of a cabin, no walls, no roof, no chimney in the conventional sense. Only this pipe, breathing like the nostril of the earth, exhaling smoke from some hidden source below. Ethan stopped in his tracks, his breath caught in his throat. "It's not a house," he whispered, though the words vanished in the thickening dusk. Marcus narrowed his eyes, studying the hollow carefully. His instincts, honed by years of moving through wild country, told him there was more here than met the eye. Slowly, he moved down the slope, testing each step, and as he reached the bottom, he saw what the forest had tried so carefully to conceal. At the base of the mound, half hidden beneath roots and drifts of leaves, was a wooden door set into the earth itself. Its surface was darkened with age, its edges reinforced with rusted iron bands, and it leaned slightly inward, as though resisting the weight of the earth pressing down upon it. The discovery sent a shiver through Ethan, who lingered at the ridge, unwilling to descend. His eyes darted from the pipe to the door, then back to the surrounding trees, searching for signs of life. But the forest was empty and still. Marcus beckoned him to follow, his voice calm, though his own pulse had quickened. Together they stood before the hidden entrance, father and son facing the unknown. Marcus crouched and brushed away the moss and leaves, revealing the outline of a handle, corroded but intact. He touched the wood, and it was cold beneath his fingers, yet faint warmth radiated from within, a reminder that the smoke above was not illusion, but the product of fire burning inside. For a moment Marcus hesitated. The rational part of him whispered that they should turn back, that whatever lay inside was none of their concern. But another part, the part forged from years of protecting hikers and enforcing safety in the wilderness, insisted that it was his duty to know. A hidden fire in a remote forest could be dangerous, a threat not only to them, but to the land itself. He placed his hand firmly on the handle and pulled. The door groaned in protest, hinges shrieking as if awakened from long sleep. With effort, he forced it open, revealing a darkness that smelled of smoke and damp wood. They stepped inside cautiously. The air was warmer, heavy with the lingering scent of fire. The narrow space was lit only by the faint glow of embers dying in a stone hearth at the far end, casting the room in flickering red shadows. It was not a cavern, nor a natural hollow, but a man-made shelter carved into the earth, its walls supported by thick logs driven vertically like crude beams. The floor was packed soil, uneven in places, scattered with pine needles and scraps of cloth. It was a dwelling, crude yet lived in, a place designed not for comfort, but for survival. Ethan's eyes widened as he took in the scene. On a rough-hewn table sat the remnants of a meal, a wooden bowl half filled with porridge, turned gray from neglect, a spoon resting beside it, a cup still holding water. Dust had not settled on them, and the porridge had not spoiled to mold. These were recent, perhaps only hours old. Nearby hung clothing on pegs, one a thick coat of modern make, the kind sold in outdoor stores, not crafted by hand. On the floor lay a pair of boots, mud still clinging to their soles, as if they had been worn that very morning. Marcus felt the weight of unease tighten in his chest. Whoever lived here hadn't gone far, and might even be watching now. He studied the walls and saw more. Maps pinned with nails, their paper yellowed but covered in markings. Some trails were crossed out in bold strokes of red, others circled in black, and in the margins were symbols he did not recognize. Crude geometric shapes repeated over and over. Ethan moved closer to one of the maps, his fingers trembling as he traced a line that seemed to correspond with the very ridge they had crossed. Someone had mapped not only the wilderness, but also their path. In the corner, beneath a pile of blankets, was a collection of objects that unsettled them further. Glass jars filled with dried berries and herbs, bundles of bones tied with string, and carved wooden figures shaped into forms that were neither animal nor entirely human. Their features were elongated, distorted, as though meant to embody something beyond the ordinary. Ethan recoiled at the sight, his stomach tightening. But Marcus forced himself to remain composed. He told himself that people in remote forests often carried traditions, rituals that outsiders did not understand. Yet even he could not shake the sense of strangeness that clung to every corner of the underground cabin. The warmth of the hearth reminded him that they were not alone. Someone had tended the fire recently, perhaps only moments before their arrival. He bent down to examine the ashes, noting the heat that still pulsed faintly against his palm. Whoever this person was, they lived here in secrecy, in deliberate isolation, and the fact that they had concealed the dwelling beneath the earth suggested they didn't wish to be found. Marcus straightened slowly, scanning the room again, his thoughts racing. Ethan stood near the doorway, his eyes darting toward the darkness outside, ready to bolt. His breathing was shallow, and he whispered to his father that they should leave. But Marcus, bound by equal measures of duty and curiosity, could not turn back so easily. He searched further, opening a wooden chest that stood against one wall. Inside were more clothes, folded neatly, and a stack of notebooks bound in leather, their pages filled with writing. He flipped through one briefly, seeing dense lines of text, diagrams of plants, drawings of the forest. There was knowledge here, but also obsession. He closed the book quickly, feeling as though he had trespassed deeper than he should. The underground cabin was not abandoned. It was lived in, carefully maintained, filled with the presence of someone who would surely return. Every detail testified to that truth. The freshly baked bread left half-eaten on a plate, the neat arrangement of jars on shelves, the orderliness of blankets on the bed. Marcus looked at his son and saw fear in his eyes, a fear that mirrored his own, but was harder to hide. They had stumbled into something meant to remain hidden, and the forest around them seemed to know it. As they stood in that uneasy silence, the last embers of the fire sighed, sending a puff of smoke upward through the pipe. Outside, the forest was darkening, the air cooling as night gathered. Marcus knew they had a choice: to leave quickly before the owner returned, or to linger in hopes of understanding what kind of person lived in such secrecy. He felt the weight of responsibility heavy on his shoulders, torn between protecting his son and satisfying the gnawing pull of curiosity that had brought them this far. Ethan shifted anxiously near the door, whispering that they needed to go. The boy's instincts screamed danger, and Marcus, though reluctant to admit it, felt the same unease twisting in his gut. But before he could act, he noticed something that froze him in place. Near the hearth, hidden partially beneath a pile of cloth, lay a pack. It was not old, not handmade, but modern bright red nylon with zippers and straps, the kind found in sporting goods stores. Mud still clung to its bottom, and one strap was frayed as though worn by long use. Ethan recognized it instantly, for he had seen similar packs among his classmates, an ordinary object made extraordinary by its presence here. The sight deepened the mystery, raising questions that neither father nor son could answer. The underground cabin breathed with the warmth of its unseen owner, and every second they remained inside felt like an intrusion that could not go unnoticed. Marcus placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder, steadying him, but the boy's fear was contagious, seeping into his own resolve. They needed to decide, and quickly, for night was closing in, and with it, the certainty that whoever lived here would soon return. The silence inside the underground dwelling pressed down heavier than the soil above it, as if the earth itself disapproved of their presence. Ethan lingered near the door, his hands trembling slightly at his sides, his eyes fixed on the shadows that stretched along the packed earthen floor. Marcus stood at the center of the room, unwilling to let fear dictate his judgment, but even he could feel the oppressive air, thick with the residue of smoke and something far less tangible. The glow of the embers had nearly faded now, casting the shelter in a dim orange light that revealed more than it concealed. It was a place built for survival, yes, but there was also an order to it, a meticulousness that betrayed intent rather than chance. The jars on the shelves were aligned with precision, the maps nailed to the wall at exact intervals, and the strange carvings that watched from their shadowed perches seemed to observe rather than merely decorate. Marcus moved toward the table again, his eyes drawn to the leather-bound notebook that rested among the other objects. It was older than the modern gear scattered about, but clearly tended to with care. He hesitated before opening it, aware of the intrusion, yet some instinct told him it was important. The pages within were crowded with words, scribbled hastily yet deliberately, as though the writer had been compelled to capture thoughts before they vanished. The entries spoke of guardians of the forest, of a presence that watched and judged, of a covenant between those who found this place and those who had always been here. The words carried both reverence and menace, a declaration that once you discovered the cabin, you belonged to it, to the land, and to those who protected its secrets. He turned page after page, frowning as he read. The dates were recent, some no more than a week old. This was not an abandoned relic of the past, but a chronicle still in progress. The most disturbing passages described rituals, initiations, offerings, ceremonies held beneath the canopy of night. The details were vague, but the tone unmistakable. They were not merely traditions, but obligations, enforced with a severity that left no room for refusal. Marcus closed the book slowly, his fingers lingering on the cracked leather cover. A cold realization passed through him. Whoever lived here, whoever wrote these words, believed them with a fervor that bordered on fanaticism. Ethan shifted uneasily, his eyes fixed on the hearth. "We shouldn't be here," he whispered, though his father did not answer. Marcus was torn between curiosity and dread, between the instinct to protect his son and the compulsion to understand the truth of what they had stumbled upon. He looked again at the walls, at the map scarred with symbols he could not decipher. Some trails were crossed with black lines, others marked with crude circles, and one in particular was traced heavily in red ink, the very path they had taken. The thought that someone had anticipated their arrival, or at the very least had noted their route, sent a shiver down his spine. He moved toward the hearth, crouching to examine the ashes more closely. The embers still glowed faintly, the warmth undeniable. This fire had not burned itself down naturally. It had been left, tended, and then abandoned with the knowledge of return. His hand hovered above the ashes, and he pulled it back quickly, unsettled by the thought that whoever had built this fire could be watching them even now. He stood and looked at Ethan, who was pale in the half-light, his lips pressed tightly together, his eyes glassy with fear. The boy was brave, but his instinct screamed danger, and Marcus knew enough of the wilderness to trust instinct, even when reason wavered. It was then that he heard it, a sound, faint but distinct, the soft crack of a branch under weight. Both father and son froze. The noise came from outside, from somewhere beyond the door. Marcus raised a hand to silence Ethan, though the boy had already stopped breathing. They listened, straining against the pounding of their own hearts. For a moment there was nothing, only the heavy stillness of the forest, pressing against the cabin walls. Then another sound, closer this time. A slow and deliberate step crushing damp leaves. Someone or something was moving out there. Ethan's hand shot toward the door, but Marcus shook his head. To rush out blindly into the dark would be foolish. Instead, he moved to extinguish the last glow of the fire, brushing dirt over the embers to mask their presence. The room sank into deeper shadow, their figures barely discernible now. Ethan's breathing quickened, and Marcus placed a steadying hand on his shoulder. He tried to project calm, but inside, his own unease grew. More sounds followed, the unmistakable rhythm of footsteps circling the hollow, pausing, then continuing. Whoever it was did not hurry. They moved with the confidence of someone who knew the land intimately, who understood that time and silence were as much weapons as strength. Ethan's knees threatened to give way, and Marcus guided him gently toward the corner, out of direct sight of the door. He positioned himself between his son and the entrance, his body instinctively shielding, though he had no weapon but the pocket knife in his pack. The footsteps halted directly outside the door. A heavy silence pressed against the wood, and Marcus could almost feel eyes studying the threshold from the other side. For an agonizing moment, nothing happened. Then, a slow drag of breath, audible even through the barrier, as if the figure outside were inhaling the scent of intruders. Ethan clutched his father's arm, his fingers digging in, and Marcus held him close, his jaw tightening. They were caught, and whether or not the figure outside had known of their presence before, it certainly did now. The door rattled faintly, as though tested by a cautious hand. It did not swing open, not yet, but the hinges groaned under a tentative push. Marcus tensed, ready to act, though he knew action would mean little against the unknown. The sound ceased, and after a long pause the footsteps retreated, slow and deliberate once more, circling again, fading into the distance. Only then did Marcus allow himself to breathe. But relief was fleeting. Whoever lived here knew they had come. It was no longer a question of secrecy, but of intent. What would be done with intruders who had entered uninvited? Ethan whispered again, more urgently now, that they needed to leave, to run, while there was still time. Marcus nodded, finally conceding to what he had resisted. They moved toward the door together, but when Marcus tried to pull it open, it resisted. The hinges that had groaned before now refused to budge. He pulled harder, bracing his foot against the frame, but it was as though the very earth had closed against them. Panic flickered in Ethan's eyes, and Marcus swallowed his own fear, forcing calm into his voice as he told his son to help push. Together they strained, the wood creaking under their combined effort, but the door remained shut, stubborn and unyielding. They turned back into the room, searching desperately for another way out. Marcus's eyes scanned the walls, the ceiling reinforced by beams, the floor that seemed solid, but might conceal a hidden hatch. In one corner, near where the pipe rose through the roof, he saw a narrow gap, a crude vent perhaps meant to draw air. Too small for him, but maybe enough for Ethan. The idea struck him like lightning. He could send his son through, out into the forest, while he remained behind. The thought chilled him, but the instinct to protect burned hotter. Before he could explain, another sound reached them, more terrifying than the first. Not a single set of footsteps now, but several, moving in unison, their cadence deliberate, ritualistic almost. The figures were returning, not one, but many, converging on the cabin. Marcus felt his heart hammering against his ribs, his mind racing through possibilities, none of them good. Ethan's eyes locked on his, wide and pleading, and Marcus gripped his shoulders firmly. He would not let his son be taken by whatever forces moved outside. The noise grew louder, surrounding them, until it seemed the entire hollow throbbed with the presence of unseen watchers. Shadows shifted against the thin cracks of the door, shapes elongated and strange in the moonlight outside. Then, silence again, heavier than before, charged with anticipation. The forest itself seemed to lean closer, listening. Marcus drew his son near, his voice steady though his soul quaked, whispering a promise that he would find a way out. The cabin, once merely unsettling, had become a trap, and the guardians described in the journal were no longer words on a page, but presences in the night. The sense of being hunted, of being studied, pressed into their bones. Father and son clung to one another in the suffocating dark, knowing that the return of the unseen dwellers was not a question of if, but when, and that their lives would never again belong solely to themselves. The silence that followed the footsteps outside was heavier than the night itself. Marcus stood motionless, his hand pressed against the wooden frame of the sealed door, feeling the faint vibrations that seemed to hum through it like the pulse of some living thing. Ethan clung to his father's side, his eyes wide and wet in the darkness, the boy's breath quick and shallow, almost loud enough to betray them. For a long moment, neither dared to move, listening to the hush of the earthbound dwelling, the slow settling of embers that still whispered faint heat beneath the smothered hearth, and the distant shift of leaves outside, where their unseen watchers lingered. Marcus's mind raced, every survival instinct sharpened by years in the wilderness, now colliding with a dread that had no name. They were not dealing with the merciless indifference of nature, but with something deliberate, something human, or close enough to human to chill him more than any wild beast could. He turned slowly, forcing his eyes to adjust to the gloom, scanning the cabin once more with the urgency of a man who knew time was running out. The exit they had used was barred, whether by design or by hands that had closed it from outside. The walls of timber and packed earth offered no weakness, save for the narrow vent he had noticed before, a crude hole leading upward to where the pipe released its smoke. It was small, narrow enough to make the passage painful, but it was hope. His first thought was of Ethan. If the boy could be forced through, he might crawl his way to freedom. Marcus could follow later if there was time. Ethan, however, understood the look in his father's eyes and shook his head violently. His voice cracked in a whisper, refusing to leave him behind. But Marcus silenced him with a firm grip and a low promise that there was no other way. Outside, the forest shifted again, the crunch of weight upon leaves unmistakable, then silence, then weight again, as though the figures circled patiently, weaving a net of fear as tight as rope. Marcus knew the time for choice was nearly gone. He pulled his son close, his voice calm though his heart thundered, telling him he must climb, that he must be stronger than fear. Ethan's eyes glistened with tears, but he nodded because he trusted his father more than he trusted the terror that encircled them. Marcus lifted him, guiding his hands to the jagged edge of the vent, steadying him as Ethan squirmed and pushed himself upward into the dark channel. The boy's breath rasped as he forced his body through the tight opening, his boots scraping against the timber, his shoulders wedged painfully until Marcus braced him from below, urging him higher. The sound of movement outside grew closer again. The door shuddered under a deliberate push, and the iron hinges groaned. Marcus whispered for Ethan to hurry, his voice fierce but loving, and the boy clawed his way toward the faintest promise of open air above. The scrape of his body against the pipe rang like thunder to Marcus's ears, but there was no stopping now. The door rattled once more, harder this time, and Marcus knew they were out of seconds. He looked up and saw Ethan's hands finally emerge into the cool night beyond the vent. The boy pulled with desperate strength until at last his body slipped through, and the faint rustle of his movement vanished into the forest above. Relief surged in Marcus's chest, but it was cut short by the deep creak of the door as it yielded an inch to the force pressing from the other side. He backed away slowly, his fists clenched, though he had no weapon worth raising, his eyes fixed on the splintering frame. He whispered one last prayer that Ethan would keep running, would not look back, would remember the path of stars above the canopy and follow them until the forest released him. The door gave way. In the widening crack, a sliver of moonlight spilled into the room, illuminating figures that moved with quiet deliberation. They entered not with the wild charge of hunters, but with the solemn pace of ritual, their shapes cloaked and indistinct, their presence filling the cabin with a suffocating weight. Faces were hidden beneath hoods or masks, crude and wooden, carved with distorted expressions that seemed neither human nor wholly of the earth. Their silence was worse than any cry. It was purposeful, as though sound was forbidden until the right moment came. Marcus stood tall, his body squared, not out of belief that he could fight them all, but out of the unyielding instinct of a father who would not show fear. They spread in a circle, their eyes, though hidden, fixing on him with an intensity that burned like fire. One raised a hand, pointing toward the vent, toward where Ethan had escaped. The gesture was slow, deliberate, and Marcus knew they were aware. They had allowed the boy to go, or perhaps they hadn't cared. The figure lowered its hand again, and all attention returned to him, as though he were the offering chosen for this night. Marcus's thoughts flew to his son, already running through the trees above, and he drew strength from the image of Ethan's footsteps, carrying him farther and farther away. He would not let fear take that from him. When the figures advanced, he met them not with a cry, but with silence of his own, his last defiance. They closed the circle, shadows merging, and the cabin seemed to shrink until it was nothing but darkness and the echo of his heartbeat. The final image that seared into his mind before the light was swallowed was not of masks or rituals, but of his son's face as he climbed, a face caught between terror and courage, and Marcus allowed himself a final surge of hope that Ethan would live. Above the hollow, the night lay heavy on the forest, the trees tall and watchful, their branches clutching at the stars. Ethan stumbled into the open air, his chest heaving, his hands raw from the climb. The forest greeted him not with comfort, but with the endless dark of its ancient silence. Behind him, the vent released its last tendrils of smoke, curling into the air like a signal that none would answer. He wanted to turn back, to wait for his father, but every instinct told him to run. The weight of unseen eyes pressed against his back, urging him onward, and he fled into the labyrinth of trunks and shadows, guided only by the memory of his father's voice. He did not know how long he ran. Time dissolved into the pounding of his heart and the rhythm of his steps. The forest closed and opened around him, branches tearing at his clothes, roots grasping at his feet. He stumbled, fell, rose again, always pushing forward. Behind him there was no sound, no pursuit he could hear, but the certainty of being watched clung to him like a shadow. At last he broke through the tree line into a clearing, the stars above brighter here, the moon casting its silver light across the ground. He collapsed onto his knees, gasping, his body trembling from exhaustion and terror. He looked back only once, toward the ridge from which he had emerged. The pipe still jutted from the mound, its smoke faint now, almost gone. The forest seemed undisturbed, as though it had swallowed everything whole and returned to its timeless watch. No figures emerged, no sound of pursuit followed. Only silence, vast and eternal, stretched across the night. Ethan wept quietly, the tears mingling with the dirt on his face, his heart aching with the knowledge that his father had not come. The boy would survive, guided by the lessons Marcus had drilled into him on countless hikes and nights beneath the stars. He would follow the streams until they led him to lower ground, would keep the North Star in sight, would ration what remained in his pack. Yet survival came at a cost heavier than hunger or cold. The cabin beneath the earth remained behind him, a wound carved into the heart of the forest, and the cloaked figures who dwelled there lingered in his memory, like a nightmare he would never shake. Ethan would never speak of what he had seen, not fully. When, days later, rescuers found him staggering along a trail, half delirious from fatigue, his words were fractured, his eyes haunted. He told them his father had stayed behind, that he had been lost in the forest, but the details refused to leave his lips. The men who searched for Marcus never found him, nor any sign of the cabin. The mound where the pipe had stood was gone, as though it had never existed, the earth smooth and unbroken beneath the pines. Only Ethan knew the truth, though even he would sometimes doubt it in the long years that followed. But in the quiet of his life, when the wind moved through the trees outside his window, he would remember the sound of deliberate footsteps circling in the night. He would see again the distorted masks in the flicker of dying firelight. He would hear the last rasp of his father's breath and feel the push of his hands urging him upward, toward freedom. The cabin beneath the earth remained unseen to the world, but it lived within him, a secret he bore with every step. And somewhere in the depths of the wilderness, hidden by silence and shadow, the guardians still waited for the next wanderers to stumble upon the smoke rising from the ground. If this story moved you, Make sure to subscribe so you never miss the next one. Take a moment to watch the next video waiting for you right now. There are more powerful stories you won't want to miss. And don't forget to share this video with friends and family. Some stories are too meaningful to keep to yourself.